My daughter has been doomscrolling for 14 weeks straight. I had heard a knock on the door, but when I opened it, no one was there. I looked around. Nothing. Then I looked down and saw it. Lying there on the doorstep was an old cell phone with a cracked screen. I picked it up and clicked the home button. It opened without a passcode, revealing a home screen with only one app. "Rebecca," I called out to my 18-year-old daughter as I stepped back inside and closed the door behind me. "You know anything about the cell phone I just found on the doorstep?" "On the doorstep?" she called back from the living room, likely scrolling away on her own phone. "Yeah, with a big crack in it?" "Nope. I guess I'll just throw it out then." "Wait, I want to see," she cried out. Her curiosity piqued as she made her way over to the kitchen. I held it up for her to see. "Ew, looks old, like from when you and Mom were growing up. When your mom and I were growing up, there were no cell phones, Becca." "Sounds boring." Yeah, it was. Perfectly boring, in the best way possible. Now look at what's become of the world. Yeah, let me see it," she said, snatching the old cracked cell phone out my hand. "What's the passcode?" "There isn't one." She opened it. "Just one app. This phone is so mid." "Mid?" I asked, unfamiliar with her Gen Z slang. "It means like mediocre, Dad. Where'd you find this thing anyway?" "I told you, on the doorstep. Someone knocked and ran away. So it's some sort of prank?" "If it is, it's a pretty mid prank," I replied, giving her the same smug look I always did when I landed a dad joke. Your jokes are not funny, Dad. Anyways, I'm gonna see what's in the app," Rebecca said, as she scurried off back to the living room and proceeded to scroll away on the cracked old phone. "Cool, let me know what you find, Becca," I said casually, as I sat back down at the dinner table and continued reading my newspaper. An hour or so later, my wife Erica returned home from work, and we had dinner. "Rebecca, it's dinner time," Erica called out from the kitchen, but my daughter didn't reply. "Becca?" I added, but again, Rebecca ignored us. My wife and I both looked at each other and rolled our eyes. "Your loss, food'll be cold again," Erica said, referring to the countless other times our social media-obsessed teen had forgone dinner so long that the meal had become cold. "Kids," I muttered under my breath. "So how was work, honey?" A few hours later, my wife and I decided to go upstairs for the night, and seeing that Rebecca was still scrolling away on the couch, reminded her that her dinner was on the table. Once again, our daughter just ignored us as she continued to scroll away on her phone. Something that, after raising an 18-year-old daughter, I was very used to. But this time, something was different. This time, she was scrolling on a different phone. The old cracked phone I had found on the doorstep, to be precise. She's still using that old thing? Wonder what app was on there. Must be some game or social media thing, I thought to myself. "Just remember to turn the lights out before you go to bed, Becca," my wife called down before we retired to our bedroom, to no reply. But the next morning, not only did we find the lights on, but we also found Rebecca still sitting there. Sure enough, scrolling away on the old cracked phone. "Rebecca," my wife called out. "Did you even sleep last night?" "Yeah, Becca. You really shouldn't be pulling all-nighters like that," I added, as I went to the kitchen to put on a pot of coffee. But before I could make it that far, something caught my eye on the kitchen table. To my disbelief, there was Rebecca's dinner, still sitting there, completely untouched. That's when I knew that something was very wrong. By the time my wife and I were able to pry the old cracked cell phone out of our daughter's hands, Rebecca had gone into a sudden fit of rage. "Give it back!" she screamed, her eyes cold and lifeless. I tossed the phone to Erica behind me, while I stood between her and our daughter. "I said, give it back," Rebecca screamed again, in a threatening fashion. "Becca, what's gotten into you?" "It's just an old phone, and a cracked one at that," I began. Before I could continue, my innocent daughter, who had never laid a finger on a soul her entire life, suddenly lunged at me, swung her arm, and ran her nails across my face, tearing the flesh from my skin and causing blood to pour down my neck. "Rebecca!" I yelled, raising my voice. But it was too late. She had already hopped over me and chased my wife into the kitchen. When I finally caught up to her at the entrance to the kitchen, I saw my daughter standing there with a steak knife on one side of the kitchen table, while my wife stood on the other, shaking in fear as she held the old cracked phone in her hand. "What was on that app?" I asked, hypothetically out loud, realizing that whatever my daughter had discovered on the phone must have been the cause of her 14-hour Doomscroll and subsequent fit of rage. But Erica must have taken me literally, immediately opening the phone and going to the app. I saw a perplexed look wash over my wife's face as she took her finger, placed it on the phone's cracked surface, and started to scroll. "No! Erica, stop!" I cried out as I ran over to her and ripped the phone from her hand. But before I could even process what had happened, I heard the steak knife that my daughter was holding fall to the kitchen floor before she too collapsed to the ground. "Becca?" I asked, confused by her sudden change of disposition, but at the same time relieved that her fit of rage had ceased. That's when I heard a growl behind me, as my daughter's rage had somehow shifted to my wife, and Erica picked up the knife from the floor. "Give it back!" my wife screamed, her eyes now cold and lifeless. I looked down at my daughter, who looked as if she had just awoken from a trance. That's when I realized that whatever curse had been bestowed upon the old cracked phone's app seemed to only affect the last person who used it. I took my dazed daughter by the hand and led her out of the kitchen, out of the house, and to the driveway, as my wife followed, still wielding the knife. "Get in," I insisted, as I opened my car door, and Rebecca hopped inside before I used my key fob to lock her inside. "Give me the phone," my wife cried from behind me as she swung the knife at me. I stepped aside and watched its blade pierce the hood of my car. I thought to call out my wife's name in an attempt to snap her out of it, but immediately realizing that there was only one way to snap her out of her trance. As she struggled to pull the blade out of the car, I seized the opportunity to run back in the house and turn on the sink in the first-floor bathroom. Eventually, my wife came back inside looking for me and, sure enough, headed for the source of the running water. And when she stepped inside, I hopped out from behind the kitchen island, slamming the door behind her, before dragging a nearby bookshelf against the door and reinforcing it with a few other heavy objects. "Give me the phone," I heard her cry out from inside the bathroom as I looked at the old cracked cell phone that I was still gripping in my hand and knew what I had to do. 30 minutes later, the deed was done. The old cracked cell phone left on a random neighbor's doorstep in the next town over, where I hoped no one would recognize me When I got back to the car, my daughter was just sitting there in the passenger seat, still traumatized and speechless from what she had just gone through. We drove home in silence, and when we finally got back, we waited by the barricaded bathroom door as my wife continued to scream, and waited until eventually she stopped. I slid the heavy objects and bookshelf aside and opened the bathroom door to find Erica just standing there, as if waking from a bad dream, the same exhausted expression on her face that I'd seen previously on my daughter. It had worked. My wife was no longer possessed by the vile device. Erica walked over and hugged me. I looked over at my daughter. She smiled. I smiled back. In that moment, two things became clear. One, someone else had been possessed by the phone prior to leaving it on my doorstep. Two, someone new was possessed by it now. But all that mattered to me in that moment was that my family was okay. I wish I could say that after the dust settled, my daughter swore off cell phones, social media, and apps altogether. But the truth is, it only took a day before she was back to doomscrolling on her own phone. Now every time she does, and her dinner gets cold, I can't help but fear that she's been possessed again. But then I realize she's just a teenager. The old cracked cell phone was gone, left on the doorstep of another family in order to save my own, and life had returned to normal. At least I thought it had. Just days after surviving a terrifying encounter with a mysterious app so addictive that it caused its victims to doom scroll indefinitely until someone else opened it, my 18-year-old daughter, Rebecca, back to her normal Gen Z self, set off for her yearly summer job as a sleepover camp counselor, which had been something of a tradition since she was a camper herself. But 2 weeks into camp, when I called to check in on her, I was shocked by what the camp director told me. "Rebecca, we didn't think she was working this year. She didn't show up." "Didn't show up? You mean she hasn't been there at all? But I dropped her off 2 weeks ago?" My mind began to race. If Rebecca hasn't been at summer camp for the past 14 days, where has she been? I began to panic, calling every one of her friend's parents, until eventually speaking with her friend Lisa's mother. "That's concerning," she said. "Lisa told us she was going on a family vacation with Rebecca, and presumably you?" Fuck, I thought to myself, realizing that this could only mean one thing. My daughter must have still been fiending for the old cracked cell phone and set off with her friend Lisa to find it. But when I began to investigate the situation further, interviewing nearly every parent and classmate I could get a hold of, it became very clear very fast that the situation was far worse than I had anticipated. According to one friend, Bobby, it turned out that a few of her friends and classmates had also gone missing. All of them apparently setting off into the woods to descend upon an old abandoned train station. After returning home, I discovered that my wife, who had also been previously possessed by the cursed cell phone, had also begun to fiend over it, her teeth chattering, her body covered in sweat. That's when I knew what I had to do. I had to destroy the phone. And after locking my wife away, with her permission, so that she too wouldn't set out looking for the app, I did just that, following in the footsteps of my daughter and her friends to the abandoned train station in the woods. After hopping a chain-link fence and trespassing into the premises, I eventually found the entrance to the station, its facade crumbling, its surface covered in spray paint. I looked down at the crowbar I was holding, an instinct grab I made on my way out of the house, and gripped it in my hand as my body trembled from fear and adrenaline. If dealing with two individuals possessed by the phone had been a terrifying ordeal, then I could only imagine what would come of confronting more. Luckily, it was only possibly for one cursed phone and one possessed person to be in there at any given time, I reasoned. But when I finally made my way inside the old train station, using the light of my cell phone to guide me through its cobwebbed and musty halls, and arrived at the train platform, I discovered that I was very wrong. There wasn't one cell phone. There were many, each one gripped by one of my daughter's friends, and herself, as what must have been a handful them or more, scrolled away, their bodies pale and emaciated from having not eaten in days. Someone must have found a way to copy the app to other phones, I thought to myself, before walking through the station, as they all swiped away and ignored me. Eventually, I stopped at my daughter Rebecca, who, sure enough, was sitting next to her friend Lisa, her eyes fixated on the app as she doom-scrolled away, just as I had seen her do at our house when she first became addicted to the phone. "Becca," I whispered, looking back to see if anyone else had heard me. But her friends were too hypnotized by their own phones to care. That is, until I tried to pry the phone out of my daughter's hand. "Rebecca, let go!" I cried out, as I managed to pull the device out of her grasp and step far enough away so that I could toss it to the ground and smash it to pieces with the crowbar. Rebecca howled out in pain, as if the blows I had struck to the phone had struck her instead, passing out when the phone was destroyed. I placed the broken phone in my pocket. Suddenly, all of the teenagers stopped doom-scrolling on their own phones and looked up, their hollow eyes locked in on one thing and one thing only: Mister. That's when they all stood up and began hobbling towards me down the shadowy platform, like zombies in the night, as they growled and hissed, their arms extended, clawing away at the air. I picked up my daughter and began backing away to what I thought was safety, but suddenly heard another of her possessed friends emerge from the darkness behind me and claw at my back, his nails tearing through my shirt and digging through my skin. I cried out, remembering the pain I had felt when my daughter had done the same to my face just 2 weeks prior. Not knowing what else to do, I temporarily placed Becca on the ground, hopped down into the old train tracks, and threw her body over my shoulder, carrying her along the tracks and into the darkness, as Becca's possessed friends chased after me. By the time I got to the end of the structure, where the train tracks ran through a tunnel and into daylight, the mob of cursed teenagers had nearly gained on me, my speed slowed by carrying my daughter. I had nearly escaped, when standing there at the entrance of the tunnel was another of her friends, silhouetted by the light behind him. I looked down at the crowbar and thought about what I might have to do to get my daughter to safety. But when I got closer, I realized that the silhouette wasn't that of one of the possessed teens, but instead, Bobby, the very friend who had told me about the train station in the first place. "Come on, Mr. Silver," Bobby called out, as I made my way over to him, and he helped me carry my daughter off into the woods, away from the possessed horde of teenagers. 14 weeks had passed since an old cracked cell phone was left on our doorstep, and my daughter had fallen under its curse. I thought I had destroyed it, back at the abandoned train station that her friend Bobby and I had rescued her from. But by the time we got home, the device's now even more cracked display had somehow turned back on, and, sure enough, Rebecca was scrolling away at it again, her face illuminated by the light of its screen. Not knowing what else to do, and fearing Rebecca might be discovered, my wife and I fired up our camper and brought her deep into the woods upstate, where we holed up and waited. Waited for what we hoped would be a cure to her obsession. But week after week, she kept scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, while I wrestled between prying the cursed phone from her hand and risking another violent attack, or leaving her alone. Ultimately, I chose the latter and let her be, as she simply sat there, day by day, at the campfire, scrolling away on her phone in silence. And then one day, just as my wife and I were adapting to our new life in the forest, my daughter suddenly stopped scrolling as she looked up from the phone, placed it in the grass beside her, stood up, and stretched. "What's for dinner, Dad?" What's that, dear?" I replied, shocked to hear her voice. "I'm hungry." "Oh, don't worry, Becca. Dinner's almost ready," I said as my wife stepped out of the camper, a look of both shock and happiness in her eyes. An hour later, as we all sat around the fire, eating some charred burgers that I had cooked too long, having been distracted by the recent development, we tried to catch up with her. "So, honey, are you okay now?" my wife asked our daughter. "Yeah, Mom. Why wouldn't I be?" "You know, 'cause of the whole scrolling thing. You relapsed, Becca. For 14 weeks, we've been waiting for you to get better," I said. "I'm better now. Don't worry, Dad." "But what happened?" My wife continued to pry, trying to get to the bottom of the mystery. "How did you get better?" "I got to the end," my daughter said. "The end of what?" I asked. "The scroll," she replied in a matter-of-fact fashion, as she chomped away at her dinner. "And what's at the end?" my wife asked. "Nothing. That's why I stopped." "And what were you scrolling through?" I continued, but my daughter didn't answer. She simply took her last bite, stood up, and walked off to the tent she had built not far from the camper. "I'm tired," Rebecca said, as disappeared into the tent. I looked at my wife, who gave me the same look she always did when I asked that question. "Come on. Eventually someone has to tell me what's on that phone. Or should I scroll myself?" I threatened, picking up the old cracked phone from the grass. "Honey, please, just stop," my wife pleaded. "Just tell me," I insisted. We're lucky she stopped. Let's just be thankful for that and move past it. Stopped for how long? Erica, it's time I know. You really want to know? I looked down at the old cracked phone. Yes. Bodies, my wife said. Bodies? Dead bodies. Just photo after photo of dead bodies. I stopped for a moment to process what she was telling me. You're telling me that she's been scrolling through photos of dead bodies for months now? Unfortunately, yes. But why? It happened to you too. What about them is so addictive? I asked. I honestly don't know. But then again, what about social media is so addictive? She joked, trying to lighten the mood. You have a point, I said, looking back to the phone. Well, I guess I'd better go destroy it either way. I stood up, but before I could take a step, my wife interrupted. Let me do it. You sure? Yeah. All you've been doing is complaining about how tired you are. And having been under its spell before, I'd like to destroy it myself. In fact, there are some rocks by the river that would work perfectly for that very purpose. All right, I agreed, not thinking much of it, trusting my wife of many years. And like that, Erica set off into the woods. As I returned to the camper, where I passed out in the bed in the back of the vehicle, where my wife and I slept. Later that night, I was suddenly awoken by the sound of the camper door opening. Assuming it was my wife having returned from destroying the phone, I didn't think much of it. "Honey, close the door, the mosquitoes will get in," I mumbled into the darkness as I tried to fall back asleep, but she neither complied nor replied. "Erica?" I asked, once again met with silence. That's when I felt a sharp metal object plunge into my shoulder. "Ah!" I screamed out in pain as my attacker swung at me again, but missed, not knowing what else to do, and unable to see in the dark. I made a dash for the door of the camper and ran outside, where the light of the moon was bright enough to illuminate my assailant. "Becca?" I asked, as I saw my daughter lashing at me with a steak knife that she must have found at the grill. "Dad, you've gotta die," she said with a blank stare. Her eyes rolled back in her head as she walked slowly towards me. "Rebecca, stop!" I cried out as I backed away, attempting to snap her out of her trance. "Dad, just let me," she said. "But why, dear? Why are you doing this?" "I told you. The scroll. It ended. We need more bodies." I continued to back away, but must have tripped over the smoldering fire pit and fell to the ground nearby. That's when she seized the opportunity and lashed out at me again, this time plunging her blade into my leg. "Ah!" I screamed out again, as my daughter tried to remove the knife, surely intent on attacking me again. We locked eyes, and I saw up close and personal the inside of her hollow eyes as they rolled back in her head. Wounded and unsure of what to do, I suddenly remembered that Erica had gone off to the river and realized that she was probably still out there. Seeking my wife's help, I pushed my daughter away and painfully hobbled to my feet before limping off into the woods. "Daddy, why are you running?" My daughter called out eerily into the forest as she casually walked through the woods behind me. I didn't reply. I simply stared in the direction of the river as I could hear its waters streaming away close by. "Daddy, I want to scroll, and I can't scroll without more photos," Rebecca called out again as she began to close in on me, but I continued to keep quiet and hobbled on as I could feel the blood draining from my body, knowing that if I could just get to my wife, she might be able to help overtake Rebecca and mend my wounds. But when I arrived at the riverbed, I found Erica sitting on a rock by the river, scrolling away on the old cracked phone with a hypnotized look on her face, her desire to scroll having clearly overcome her mission to destroy it. I limped over to my wife and tried to pry it out of her hand. "Honey, get off the phone. Rebecca, she's trying to kill me. Help!" I exclaimed. But my wife simply growled at me, lashing at my skin with her nails before snatching the phone back. My skin burning from the scratches, I leapt back, landing on my wounded leg, only to hear my daughter closing in from behind me. I turned to look at Rebecca as she approached, then back at my wife, who had returned to scrolling. Unsure of which direction to go, I walked back to my wife and ripped the phone from her hand as hard as I could, causing her to cry out in horror and swing at me, knocking me into the shallow river, where my body was half submerged into water. My wife stood up, hopped into the river, and began attacking me, desperately trying to get the phone back, as my daughter joined in and began shoving my head underwater, attempting to drown me. Just die already, Dad, Rebecca said, in a hauntingly matter-of-fact tone. Lying there in the river, my head submerged underwater as I held my breath, I did the only thing I could think of, taking the old cracked phone that I was still holding in my hand and plunging it into the river behind me, holding it there for as long as possible. A good minute or two must have gone by as I struggled to hold my breath while they continued to attack me, until I eventually couldn't hold it anymore and resigned to die there in the river, a victim of the old cracked phone's curse. Until suddenly, just as my eyes were glazing over and I couldn't hold my breath any longer, my wife and daughter stopped what they were doing and backed away, out of the water and onto the dry land of the riverbed. "What happened?" my wife asked, awaking from her trance as I sat up in the river, coughing frantically. She turned her gaze from my scratched body to her bloody fingernails, and her eyes opened wide in horror. "Where are we?" my daughter added, as she too turned her stare from my wounded, bleeding body to her own, which was completely soaked in my blood and had the same reaction. As I continued to clear the river's water from my lungs, I looked down to find my hand still clenching the old cracked cell phone. I looked back at my wife and daughter, expecting them to see the device and lunge at me. But when they finally noticed it, they each simply both took a step back in fear. I, on the other hand, raised the phone closer to my face and attempted to turn it on. "Dad! No!" my daughter screamed as my wife joined in. "Honey, stop!" But no matter how many times I tried to turn it on, the old cracked phone remained unresponsive, clearly destroyed from the water damage. 2 minutes! I screamed at them, with a furious look on my face. They looked back at me in silence, a look of horror on each of their faces, unsure of where I was going with the statement. It took 2 minutes for that thing to get fried in the river. Yet I dropped my cell phone into the toilet for 10 seconds, and it's ruined immediately, I called out, before tossing the damaged phone into the middle of the river, seeking to rid myself and my family of it forever. Erica and Rebecca stood there for a second as they processed what I said, until realizing that I had made another one of my dad jokes. They both looked at each other in silence before suddenly bursting out into laughter together, something I hadn't heard from the two of them in months. I couldn't help but join in on the laughter as I sat there in the river, soaking under the moonlight, my shoulder and leg bleeding out as we all let out sighs of relief. My wife and daughter ran over to help me out of the river and brought me back to the camper, where they scrambled to patch up my weary body. 2 hours later, I was getting checked into the emergency room of the nearest hospital, my wife's makeshift tourniquets having held over long enough for me to survive. That night, as my wife and daughter slept in the hospital room beside me, just before I passed out, the thought crossed my mind that they might attack me in the middle of the night. But the next morning, I woke up to their smiling faces. "Morning, honey," my wife said. "Morning, Dad," my daughter added, before they both took a seat behind me. That's when I noticed it. A cell phone in my daughter's hand as she furiously scrolled away. My eyes opened wide in horror, and I sat up in my seat, poised to hop out and rip it from her hands before my wife called out calmly, "Hey, take it easy. It's just a new one. We ran out this morning while you were asleep to get it." "New one?" I asked, still in shock. "Yeah, Dad," my daughter said. "I've got to communicate with my friends somehow." I let out a sigh of relief. as I realized it was just a harmless, regular new cell phone. But before I could bask in the moment, my daughter added, "Oh, by the way, Bobby's asking for you. He told me to tell you something." "Bobby?" I said, having almost completely forgotten Rebecca's friend Bobby, who had helped me rescue my daughter from the abandoned train station. Suddenly, the entire experience came rushing back to me, and the hairs on my arms stood up. "Oh, right, Bobby? What did he say?" I asked, trying to remain calm. "We have to talk about the others," my daughter said, reading their text correspondence aloud. "And I know who left it at your doorstep." I let out a sigh, as my brief moment of solace, naively thinking that the cell phone was behind us, came to an abrupt end, and I suddenly realized that the journey was far from over. Aha! You survived the story. Think you can handle how deep, dark, and disturbing the rabbit hole goes? Click on the playlist and let me know in the comments where your breaking point is.